I'm really honored, and it's a pleasure to be here and give you just my perspective and my thoughts on the ethics of artificial intelligence. Now, normally a talk like this is half tech and half philosophical, but I'll try to make it a bit more maybe engaging or more interactive. So my question for you is, what is something that you are sure of? Go on, just say something that you are absolutely sure of.
My name.
You're sure of your name? Okay, that's a good answer. Huh? Death and taxes, yes. Well, yes, indeed, there are some very specific finite things that we can be sure of. But broadly, there aren't as many. I mean, can we be sure of ourselves? Or are we simply just simulations within our brain? Is it that our neural networks respond to stimuli in our environment and just render this illusionary sense of self? So can we really be sure of who we are? Is it that just an injection of oxytocin and dopamine is going to change our entire personality and make us into something different? Are we sure of our reality? Or are we just wave particles collapsing, and we are just limited by our four-dimensional kind of ability to recognize senses and ability to recognize reality, although we are, we have what we are so proud of, and this is human intelligence. Although we are so intelligent, we are still so limited, and we still can't understand what the heck reality actually is. And are we really sure of our relationships, or are they just kind of self-perpetuating narratives in this world, sometimes getting better, but most of the times just getting worse because they are just crippled and walk on the crutches of technologies. And we think that when we talk to each other or when we interact with each other online, we think that that is a meaningful social interaction, when in fact we feel lonelier and colder and emptier inside. So I'm asking these questions because I need to raise the point that our brains are wired for certainty. From birth to death, we simply collect information with the whole purpose of packaging that information into concepts that we can physically or intellectually manipulate and work with. It's simply because our brain structures are only able to learn by repetition and reinforcement. But I think that this desire for certainty can limit us and can empower us, right? Through certainty and through scientific discovery, we're able to build tools that are absolutely outstanding. But at the same time, our low threshold for tolerated ambiguity gets in the way of truly understanding what we're dealing with. For example, when we think of black holes, we imagine these tunnels, these holes through the universe, when in fact they might be actually spheres where there is an absolutely incredible, like million times heavier in terms of mass than the sun. They might be spheres, or they might take a different shape or form. But we simply come back to things that we are familiar with, and I think that that is the case with artificial intelligence as well. We confuse artificial intelligence with something that is self-aware or something that has the ability to truly understand, and that's just not the case. So let's be aware of our need for certainty, and realize that when we try to come back to something familiar, we actually get in the way of understanding what the heck something really is. And I think that this is specifically, so artificial intelligence is really not human-level intelligence. It has nothing to do with humans. It's simply just a mathematical, it's a system where we have algorithms that are optimized for a certain type of performance. That's what it truly is. So coming back to the idea of ethics, I'd like to draw a very important distinction between what is ethics and what are ethical standards. So I think that at the core of all ethical discussions is a continuous negotiation that tries to figure out what is truly fair and what is truly trustworthy in this world. And this negotiation carries on, it continues, it's on and on and on. And it really depends on different cultural nuances. It depends on what we think is right or wrong. So this discussion continues forever. However, sometimes society does need a little bit of certainty, and we really need to understand, okay, so what have we agreed that fairness means? Okay, what have we agreed that good means today? With artificial intelligence coming into our awareness and coming into the world, this negotiation, this constant discussion is being a little bit disrupted, and that's why we are like, hold on, what do we mean by good AI? What do we mean by bad AI, right? So you need to understand that this negotiation needs to continue, whereas ethical standards do not have to continue. They are simply more concrete ways of anchoring this discussion, right? So we say with an ethical standard that we care about fairness or we care about transparency, but what it truly means is not something that is dealt with in an ethical standard, okay? So there's a distinction between the continuous negotiation of what is ethical and an ethical framework. So that's why initially I was asking the question, what are you sure of? Because we need, as a civilization, we need to understand that perhaps finding an ultimate ethical framework is impossible, simply because this negotiation of what is right or wrong needs to continue, needs to be ongoing. However, we need to deal with the fact that reaching and finding an ultimate ethical framework is impossible, and we need to learn to build ethical products without having that ethical framework, or without having maybe a part of it, okay? So there are a couple of ethical frameworks out there, and there are many that are being built, okay? These are some of them that I have been personally aware of, and I've been personally involved in the IEEE working groups, just trying to define some of the standards, okay? So because I've been involved with the IEEE, I'm aware of a couple of principles that we as an organization have proposed and said, we kind of think that when we build AI, we want to care about human well-being, we want to care about accountability, we want to care about transparency and awareness of misuse. Recently, however, the European high-level group on artificial intelligence has added a bunch of other requirements and other principles. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to use a bunch in a negative way. I'm just trying to say that there are ethical frameworks that have less or more principles. Okay? So these are some of the requirements and additional principles that have been added as of this year. So can we possibly be sure that we are able to comply with all of these principles? It's quite hard, because in all fairness, it's actually quite easy to game a system, even if you have an ethical framework or a principle. It's quite, if you're clever enough, you know kind of how to trespass it. But there are gray areas. When it comes, for example, to explainability, you can look at algorithmic explainability, which basically says your model needs to be interpretable, and you have user-centered explainability, which says you just need to be able to explain to users how decisions are being made. So there is an in-between there, right? Instead of saying, well, all AI is a black box system, perhaps you can find models that increase explainability. Maybe there's a gray area there. And instead of saying, well, people will never be able to understand what AI does and how it makes decisions, maybe there's a gray area there. Maybe you can have user-friendly explainability, right? So you don't have to comply, you don't have a no comply, or yes, you do comply kind of two options there. There's a gray area, okay? So I'd like to invite here on the stage, I'd like to invite two experts who are going to kind of pull down this negotiation. And we're going to address it from the perspective of the law and from the perspective of businesses. So I'd like to invite here Mr. Mark Piers. Oh, sorry. So Mark Peerce is a partner, intellectual property partner at Mills & Reeve, and Professor Pinar Akman, an expert in competitive law or competition law? One of them, competition law. All right. So guys, initially I started with the proposition that it's impossible to achieve consensus when it comes to finding an ethical framework. What is your position on an ethical framework? What is your personal consensus of what is an ethical framework?
So I really like the slide you had up earlier that talked about an ethical framework as a constant negotiation. I just don't think that you'll ever have an ethical framework which is set in stone. And in fact, if you look outside of the AI sphere and you look at ethical frameworks that we've got developed, really well developed as a 21st century society, those ethical frameworks are very different from what we had in the 19th century.
They are.
And they'll continue to develop. So a framework is not something that's set in stone, but I think it is increasingly something that reflects. You had up there the principles from the European Union ethics paper, and those first four principles, I think, are at the core of almost any ethics framework that we're going to have in AI. And I think, to an extent, that's non-controversial, but that's my position, is it's a moving feast,
right.
But it's a feast that's moving along a set of at least relatively clear guidelines.
Okay.
Thank you. I agree, and I mean, consensus is a really big word, and let's not forget in democracies we don't need consensus, we only need majority. And let's also not forget when we have these principles we're discussing, we are usually looking at principles agreed upon in Western democracies, and we expect the development of technology to be in line with the principles that we take as guiding principles in our daily life. So we expect artificial intelligence really to be subject to the same principles, ethical principles, that we find ourselves to be subject to, like non-discrimination, transparency, accountability, and so on. And yes, we don't necessarily need an overarching framework, and we don't necessarily need even a consensus, but there will have to be some guiding principles that we take as principles that lead all aspects of our life, which will also lead the development of artificial intelligence.
Okay. That's fair enough. So we don't need any specific ethical framework, but could you name some principles that you really care about personally, that you feel like are universally important when it comes to building artificial intelligence?
Respect for basic fundamental rights. That includes, foremost these days, given the use of personal data, respect for privacy, accountability, non-discrimination, transparency. And I know that some of these raise higher levels of challenges in terms of the technology being able to comply with them, but right. I think that's where we'll see the issues rising up in future. You know, how can you make the technology comply with the principle of accountability or transparency, right, when there is a black box involved? And those will be the issues that we'll have to face with, I think.
Absolutely.
Most of all.
I think that the fundamentals are, I mean, all of those I agree with. Fairness, I think, comes into equal. Yeah, but fairness fundamentally is right at the heart of it. Okay. But I also don't think that the basic principles that guide an ethics framework for AI are any different from the basic principles that guide the ethics framework for cars or anything. I mean, in the end, what we're looking at is a technology that impacts on human existence in the same way that the automobile impacted on human existence. And what we are trying to ensure is that we have a framework that benefits mankind in the way that we understand it to be a benefit to mankind. But fundamentally, then I come back to all those same points, because I think they are the basic principles.
But humankind and the reality that we have to deal with changes constantly. Do you anticipate any changes to how we interpret fairness, what it means to be fair in this world, considering advances in technologies and, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do we deal
I mean,
with
if you go back, and again, taking us outside of AI, go back to the beginning of the 20th century, and look at what people considered to be fair in the United Kingdom, for instance, which is where we are now. And you had a system where it was considered fair that more than 50% of the population couldn't vote.
Exactly.
You go back another 100 years, and you have a system where it was considered fair that people could own other people. So what's considered fair in society is changing all the time. So yes, I anticipate change, but I have no idea what that change will look like, because we simply can't go. We can postulate, But yeah, I think inevitably what's considered to be fair will change. And I think we're beginning to see that to an extent already with the Facebook issues around data.
Right.
Those are issues that we weren't thinking about 20 years ago. People weren't concerned about the misuse of vast amounts of data, because you couldn't misuse vast amounts of data 20 years ago.
Right, and now we discovered that you can misuse data. Okay, so what, from your perspective, what are some adaptations to changing definitions around fairness or transparency? How, from your perspective, how do we approach this change?
I mean, I think I personally, in my own research, try to avoid using actually the concept of fairness as a guiding principle, because what's fair to me is not necessarily going to be what's fair to you, and that's not going to be necessarily what's fair to
not
a
fair
third
to
party.
the business.
Not fair to businesses might be. So fairness is perhaps not the best guiding principle, and it's not the most concrete. But things like transparency, explainability, accountability, these are principles we can put, flesh on the bones of. When I want accountability, I want someone to be accountable if a self-driving car causes an accident. I want to know who will be accountable. When I say transparency, if a company has taken a credit decision in an application that I have made, I want to know how that decision was reached. I suppose for technology purposes, a little bit of being able to reverse engineer that decision and understand how that decision was taken. And when I talk about autonomy, I want to have the freedom not to be subject to automated decisions, for example. So there are far more concrete principles that we can adopt as part of a growing and developing ethical framework than something like fairness, for example. And how will this change in future? I think in some years' time, there will be some red lines in terms of development of AI. Some of these ethical principles will be taken on board by lawmakers and incorporated in the law, and there will be probably certain red lines which are going to come out of the ethical framework in terms of the law. Certain developments might be, and probably should be, or I don't know. That's probably a technological question to be had too. Prohibited that as a society we will not want this sort of AI to be developed, and there will be some red lines in future, I would think.
I see. So are you implying that some principles are just too difficult to pursue compliance with, but in the meantime some are kind of technically it's realistic from a technical perspective to comply with?
Like fairness? I mean, that's not even just difficult from a technical perspective, it's difficult even from a conceptual perspective, a philosophical perspective. Since Aristotle, philosophers have been trying to describe what's fairness.
Right.
And there isn't a uniform decision. Like in commercial disputes, most specifically in this jurisdiction, not so much perhaps in other parts of Europe, courts will always avoid engaging with questions of fairness. In contract disputes, commercial disputes, they will not engage with that question. So I don't see those courts engaging with issues of fairness when it comes to decisions made by AI either. But I can see them engaging with questions of transparency, accountability, explainability, and so on.
Right, I see.
I think you're absolutely right. So the courts, the UK courts, will not look at questions of fairness because they simply aren't the right place to do that. But the fact that a concept like fairness is incredibly difficult to handle, the fact that it's almost impossible to get a consensus on what is fair because people are coming from different positions, I don't think that means that fairness isn't something that should be at the heart of an ethical framework. We should be striving for fairness, but actually what falls out of that is you can get consensus around some of the other aspects that we've talked about. So I think that's really important. I always have a bit of an issue here with transparency. How many people in the room have flown this year? How many people in the room can explain how that aeroplane got them where they got to? Great, we've got an aerodynamic engineer, fantastic. Transparency is an interesting concept because most people drive cars, most people don't or couldn't explain in detail how their car works, but they know the fundamental principles. You put petrol or electricity or diesel in and the car moves because energy is transformed into kinetic energy and then you get to where you get to. For me, that sort of level of understanding of AI is going to be fine, but we're not there yet. And I think we're really grappling with what transparency means because people are trying to explain how algorithms work. And we're never going to get to the point where the majority of people who are users of AI understand how algorithms work. And as AI becomes more and more prevalent, there's going to be less and less understanding of the detailed way in which the technology works. But the results of the technology and the basis perhaps on which some of those decisions are made can be made transparent. I think it's really important that that's what we're aiming to achieve.
It seems like this is more of a societal problem that gravitates around the idea of can we really understand and does everybody need to understand? But from a technical perspective, I just want to go back to technical implementation, what we can do as developers or creators of artificial intelligence. What are the challenges for us when it comes to implementing some of these principles? Fairness maybe means bias. Maybe fairness means that every outcome is fair to any human being. More transparency or explainability. What are the challenges to implementing these principles?
Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do there is wind back a step before looking at how many people in the room are developers, by the way? That's good. So actually probably just about a majority. Before looking at how you guys can implement an ethical framework when you're doing your day-to-day job of developing, I think a really important point, we talked about, again, we had that slide, it's a constant negotiation. It's a constant negotiation with lots and lots of stakeholders in it. And there are lots of stakeholders engaged in this conversation about what an ethical framework should look like, who are not technicians, don't necessarily understand it, but understand perhaps the implications or have false views of what the implications might be. I don't think we're hearing enough noise from the development community about what ethical frameworks should look like. And I don't think that the technical community is engaging as much as it should be in an ethical framework. Because if you're not careful, what happens is you get an ethical framework imposed by people who don't understand what is driving the technology and how it works, and a sort of top-down ethical framework dictated by people who don't understand the technology is never going to be as good as an ethical framework that's developed with some real engagement from the development
That's very interesting. I'm just going to pause. How many of you feel like there are these moralists and ethicists carrying an ethical stick and trying to coerce you to implement an ethical principle that you may not necessarily agree with? Just raise your hand. Okay. And that stifles your ability to do any data analysis.
Okay, and that's really interesting because I can tell you now that so 30. I mean, I've been doing what I do for just over 30 years. I'm an intellectual property lawyer, and for most of that, I've been an intellectual property litigator. And one of the first jobs I ever got, as effectively as a paralegal, some 32 years ago now, I think, was to go through every decision that had been reached by a bunch of judges on a particular issue, so that we could choose which judge we wanted to try and get in front of on a case we had. And so we do that. Lawyers have done that. And that was 30 years ago, and 100 years ago, lawyers were doing that exact same exercise. So why have the French banned that? Presumably because it's seen as being unfair on judges to have that analysis done. It's always been done. The fact it's being done by AI makes no difference. I think that's frankly slightly absurd.
So let's hear from Professor Pinar.
No, I agree. I fully agree. And I mean, I'm a competition lawyer, and the way I come to AI is how businesses use AI to take market-relevant outcomes, may have to do with what price to sell their goods at on Amazon, or whether they should be, monitoring their competitors' prices to align with their prices, and whether we see that more and more businesses use algorithms to automatically set prices in line with their competitors. Well, if you actually knowingly fix your prices with your competitors, that's a criminal offense in this country, and it's a cartel. So the question is, there are lots of questions, but one of them is, can it actually be avoided? So we see in policy circles a lot of policymakers saying, well, we will not tolerate price fixing by algorithms as we will not tolerate price fixing by managers. So it's the business's responsibility to make sure that when they use artificial intelligence or variations of it, they don't fix prices with their competitors. And then I asked the technologist friends I have, well, is it actually possible to do this to adopt this sort of compliance by design, that when you write these programs and so on, you can be 100% confident that it will never fix prices with your rivals, even though the objective is to maximize your profit. And the answer is usually, no, it's not possible. So policy circles and policymakers are pushing for compliance by design in all areas, whereas the technologists are saying that's not even possible to achieve with the current technology we have.
That's very interesting. So it's coming back to your point that developers need to say something when it comes to these principles being imposed.
Sure. I think that's absolutely right. And then the next step actually is in terms of what are you doing. I think so far most of the real ethical challenges that AI has faced have not been really about AI, but about what the AI is doing. So let's look at Cambridge Analytica. Clearly what they were doing was unethical. I think does anyone in the room not think that Cambridge Analytica and what they were doing with that data was unethical? So everybody in the room thinks it was unethical. The guys in the business must have known it was unethical. That's not an AI question. That's a question about business ethics. Okay? AI has enabled them to do something they couldn't previously done, which was unethical. You can't lay that at the door of the technology. You lay that at the door of the people who have decided to use the technology in the way it was done. And part of the developer thing is, I can't remember the name of the guy who was the whistleblower, who was a developer, wasn't he? Now that's ethical behaviour. He recognised that what was going on was unethical and he called them out on it. So that's one of the ways, beyond developing the framework, one of the ways that developers need to be involved. If you are involved in something that is clearly unethical, say
something.
So.
Sorry. All right, so then we're looking at responsibility, because you guys have been even hinting at who is truly responsible. But I'd like to further narrow down this question, okay? So for example, Mark, if somebody would develop a system that automatically decides which trademarks are being granted, or, logos, whatever. But somehow I
think I can go and pay something and get that service now.
Right. And then down the line you realize that, oh my God, there's a likelihood that Western countries are awarded these trademarks more often simply because of, I'm not sure what association there, right? Yep. Concept drift, etc. Right? So how do we? So it's not after the fact, but before the fact. How do teams take responsibility from your perspective for, developing something that is as ethically aligned as possible within the industry and within their technological needs?
Okay. So I think the starting point is to talk about these things. I think the starting point is actually, as a community, to be talking. To be engaging with each other on what is ethical, and with engaging with the outside world as well. I mean, it's really important with any sort of ethical framework that the people who see the results of that framework in action are engaged in developing it. So the developer community, and I guess the business owners above them as well, need to not only engage with each other and talk about ethics, but also to talk to the broader community about ethics.
Got it. What is your perspective?
I agree. I mean, they need to be having these conversations about ethics if they're developing AI that will have ethical implications. And also, I suppose, those using the data have to make sure that the data set itself doesn't suffer from issues such as discrimination, bias, infringement of privacy, and so on.
Right.
And it's not easy, of course, but I guess that's what it involves.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn it back to the audience. So when it comes to practical advice, the most natural question, okay, so why is it that, what should we do? But instead of turning back to you, I'd like to turn back to the audience. What are your challenges? What kind of advice do you need? What are your questions around implementing ethics in artificial intelligence? And I will volunteer the mic so you guys are heard.
Hi there. My question is, to what extent do you think that a lot of the discussions about ethical AI now that are taking place in these sort of partnerships on AI and these other institutions, how much of it is a kind of a bit of a distraction, if you like, from something more concrete like regulation or enforcement? So it's nice to talk about all these high-level principles, but do they actually have any teeth? Does that's my question.
Thank you. No, they don't currently have TEET as such, and we should also mention, I think Mark might disagree with this, but 80% of all AI-related patents were filed by Chinese businesses last year. And China also apparently has 1/3 of unicorns as of last year. And China is not party to any of those principles that have been even loosely adopted by international organizations like the OECD and obviously not the EU principles. So unless everybody sort of comes on board these ethical principles, there's a big challenge there in terms of it having any teeth anyway. And also I think some of these principles, as I said earlier, will have to be adopted in terms of regulation and law. Then it will have teeth because you will have to comply with these principles.
Teeth that bite back.
Pardon?
Teeth that bite back.
It will,
You get
yes.
fined for. Right.
Okay, so the first thing I'm going to deal with is the patents. So the numbers,
Mark,
right?
one second. Are there any questions that are burning? And then I'll let you carry on. Just put your hands up so I'm aware. Okay, so we have one question there and one question there. Okay. So very brief answer.
So yeah, 80% of the patents granted were granted to Chinese companies, and most of them are rubbish, and won't stand up even in the Chinese courts. But never mind. So the question was about whether this is a conversation that's should be really about regulation, and clearly there's going to need to be some regulation. But I think it's really important to separate the question of ethics and the question of regulation. Regulation is something that's driven by ethics. Okay, and if you look at the introduction to the European Union ethics paper, which is a flawed paper in many ways, but actually there's quite a lot in there that's good as well. It talks in the introduction about a three-limbed approach to achieving trustworthy AI, and that's what it's all about. It's about getting artificial intelligence to the public that society trusts as a concept, as a thing. And it separates their three. The third limb is robustness. It needs to be something that works and is reliable. The first limb is regulation. The second limb is ethics. Ethics drive regulation. Laws are passed because society agrees that they should be passed. You know, murder is a crime because ethically we all agree that killing people is wrong. But we have to agree that first. So we need an ethical conversation before we can have regulation.
Right. Hi. So I recently saw some figures with regards to self-driving cars and how people would choose to save or sacrifice a particular group of people, whether they were younger or older, like the classic philosophical problem. I can't remember who it was that did it, but the question I have is that, well, one of the outcomes of that was that in Asia and the East, people value certain characteristics in people differently. So they value age over youth and experience, over inexperience and potential. So considering that China has such a dominant position in terms of patents being filed, what do you think a sort of global stance on these kinds of ethics would be when there's such a different basic view on either aspect?
So there was a really weird echo there. So the question is really about whether you can have a global ethical framework when you've got so many different current ethical. You know, we think differently.
But also China being such a dominant power in the AI industry.
It's a really interesting question because obviously we've never had a global ethical framework before. There are, I think, ethical questions that pretty much the world across we agree with. But if you drill down to many things, the Chinese will have a very different view to the Europeans, and we'll have a different view to the Americans. It's becoming increasingly clear that there are some really different ethical views in the States around non-AI related issues. But
so what's the solution? What do we do?
I'm not sure I've got a solution to that. It's a really big issue. We were talking before we came in actually about the fact that historically we've had legal systems that dealt with national issues, and that was fine, and then you went somewhere else and dealt with it. But the point about modern society is that borders don't really count in the world of the internet and AI, and that we are having to adapt to a situation that we have never had before. We've come from a society not that long ago in real terms where we lived with ethical frameworks that could be developed village by village without, oh God, I hate myself for saying this, but we're a global village now. And it's a really good question, but I don't know what the answer is.
That's totally fine. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. So just a few conclusions. I think from my perspective, thank you so much for participating. So my perspectives and my takeaways for you are, please speak up when you see something that is unethical. Try to take action on it. The other takeaway is the negotiation and the discussion is ongoing, and it varies from region to region. We have to understand that this is the reality. We don't have an ethical framework that applies to everybody. However, just like yourself, you raised a question. Let's raise this question even more so that we try to get towards solutions. Thank you so much, and thank you for your time, guys.